Welcome. We are in Prague, in the capital of the Czech Republic. There is a big conference taking place here of the European Consortium for Political Research, and I've been very fortunate to have a keynote speaker at our conference, Professor Maria Popova, who is a professor of political science at McGill University in Montreal in Canada, and an author of a forthcoming study, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. And that is very much one of the key areas I would like to discuss with you today. We are sitting at an interesting place. This is a memorial in Prague dedicated to the victims of communist oppression in Czechoslovakia. And this is something perhaps that we could say the Czech Republic, Ukraine and Russia have in common, right? People refer to them as post-communist countries. How do you feel about that legacy of communism?
It's a very interesting and important question, because we have to wonder how long are we going to call these countries post-communist, even though it's now been 30 years that they are past this point. And I think it's really fitting that we're here at this monument, because the common thread is the victimization during communism, the experience, the legacy of authoritarianism. The other part of the common thread is how different societies who went through this are going to work out what that period meant. So the memory politics of it is also important. But in terms of their current politics, I think at this point we have to say and we have to recognize that the countries have diverged so majorly that they have very little in common anymore in terms of how their domestic politics now work. Obviously, some countries have consolidated strong democracies, leading in freedom of the economy, freedom of speech. And other countries like Russia and some of the dictatorships in Central Asia are at the bottom of the freedom rating. So they have diverged tremendously, but the common legacy is the legacy of how we remember that period.
So in Prague, in this place, one could sometimes have the impression that these times are well behind, kind of tourist attractions, if you want, while in Russia, of course, those legacies are still very much present. In fact, it seems that President Vladimir Putin wants to reclaim the legacy of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union proper to some extent. He famously described the demise of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. A simple question that has no simple answer.
Yeah.
Why did Russia invade Ukraine?
What we argue in the book that we have coming out is that the main reason for this invasion is that the divergence between Russia and Ukraine became really big over the last 20 years.
So these are the legacies of communism.
Right.
These two countries.
They started out very, very similarly. But over the last 20 years, since about the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, the two countries sort of took very different forks in the road. And they diverged, and Ukraine became more and more a competitive regime, a democracy, confident in its own identity. And Russia became an autocracy, very much revanchist, insecure about its identity and its legacy and its previous imperial identity. And, you know, these countries could have continued this divergence, but the reason the war is happening is that Russia wanted to bridge that gap, was not okay, did not accept this divergence, wanted to reverse the divergence, go back to square one, and sort of bring Ukraine back into the fold of the Russian world, roll back the years, and Ukraine simply refused to go along with it. And Russia tried in the years running up, in the last 9 years, tried through more limited war, still military aggression, but a little bit more limited, to reverse time. But since it wasn't managing to do it, eventually this led to the full-scale invasion of 22.
But Ukraine post-communist history itself has been rather turbulent, right? And there was a significant constituency proportion of Ukrainians who did seem to be fairly positive towards Russia. Tragically, perhaps, the very name of the country, right? I'm anxious not to say the Ukraine, right? Because I would devalue the statehood of Ukraine, because the Ukraine stands for a land in between, right? But there was a contestation over the last couple of decades over the direction of the country. Could you elaborate on this? Is there a kind of pro-Russian constituency still there?
Absolutely, there was a lot of contestation. That's what we explain in the book, that this is a long, drawn-out process of divergence that started with small differences in the beginning. And the reason these were small differences was indeed because there was a substantial portion in Ukraine, about 50% in fact in the beginning, who saw their history and their future as both of them strongly intertwined with Russia. But over time, this escalatory cycle that we talk about in the book between Russia and Ukraine heightened the divergence. As Russia tried to push Ukraine more to roll back the changes, it actually pushed Ukraine into further changes. And so what we observe in the last 30 years is really the development of an identity within Ukraine that sees Ukraine, that is committed, a civic identity that's committed to the Ukrainian state and its independence, and is initially, they were thinking that they could have this independence and still be on friendly terms with Russia, friendly but separate. Over time, as Russia pushed more and more, Ukrainians pulled away more and more, and dwindling proportions of Ukrainians were still holding on to this idea that Ukraine and Russia belong together. And as this decreased, it heightened Russia's appetite to actually grab it through other means, and now it's trying to do it through military aggression, but it's trying to roll back this identity that has formed over the last 20, 30 years when really in this competition between the pro-Russian version of Ukrainian identity and the distinctive European identity of Ukraine as the other version, the European identity has been slowly gaining consensus.